Well, I think it's consistent with how he's behaved throughout the war, wanting to show that he's with the troops, that he's unafraid. It seems like a consistent with his behavior really from beginning to end. He's been a brave, a surprisingly brave and effective leader so far, and this seems entirely consistent with how he's behaved before, wanting to make sure he's with the troops, with the people, not hiding, and out there in front.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the footage released by his office showing him giving medals to soldiers who must be so battered and bruised. He said, "I'm honored to be here today in the east of our country and to award our heroes, to thank you, to shake your hands." And then he goes back to Kiev, to the presidential palace, to talk to his generals and to continue the strategy. But they've got to continue fighting. And I mean, who knows what the true situation is there? Both sides bogged down.
It does look like it's become pretty much of a slog, and a tragic slog in some sense. The tide seems to have turned a teeny bit in favor of the Russians, but it's hard to know that for sure. The Ukrainians continue to fight bravely, and whatever this vaunted spring offensive of Russia's, it hasn't amounted to much so far. So it is unfortunately settled into this grinding, brutal slog, really on both sides, with the Russians continuing to do lots of drone strikes, kill lots of civilians, do things that are in general against the laws of war.
You talk about the laws of war and you hint at prior conflicts and history. What does history tell us about how stalemates, awful, bloody, brutal, costly stalemates like this, how they tend to get resolved?
But I think the history is pretty ambiguous about that. We've had in the distant past 100 years of war, a 30 years war. I don't think we'll have one of those in this case. And we've seen some conflicts that have become what we've come to think of as frozen conflicts. And I suppose that's how we would have characterized Ukraine before this most recent Russian attack. After 2014, it was a kind of frozen conflict with nothing much happening, occasional artillery fire in the east, but the line of conflict not changing very much. It's conceivable that we're back there into this kind of frozen conflict. Unfortunately, it's frozen at a much higher level of suffering and killing, particularly given that the Russians have been targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. But it is easy to see it. I'm afraid all too easy to see it staying that way for some time. I think Vladimir Putin has absolutely no incentive to negotiate seriously. The Ukrainians have laid out pretty maximalist demands on their side, and on Putin's side, who knows? In 2 years, he might have his friend Donald Trump back in the White House, and that would be the end of assistance for Ukraine. So I think he has really no reason at all to try and negotiate, and that he will continue to see if he can make some gains on the battlefield, but in any case, just hang in there.
Yeah, I think we're going to need to come to the geopolitics of it in more detail in just a moment. Just looking at the announcements that have come from Poland and from Slovakia announcing MiG-29s. I think the Slovakians to transfer 13 and the Poles 4. How significant a move might this be?
I think it's significant. It does give them, it gives the Ukrainians more capability. It probably also gives them, though they're not going to risk them, I suppose, in dangerous airspace. It's significant, not a sea change, small numbers, but these are ones that actually the Ukrainians can fly with minimal training. So it's significant. I think it's also significant as a kind of line that the NATO alliance has crossed, and bit by bit, we have said, whether we've intended to or not, that yes, we're going to give the Ukrainians wherewithal, and including wherewithal that might let them strike the bases outside Ukraine from which the Russians are launching attacks.
Mm. And what about the meeting between Presidents Xi and Putin? How significant do you think that was? And how seriously can the Ukrainians take any Chinese plan that's come essentially unilaterally from Beijing with a bit of chat from Moscow?
Yeah, I think on the last question, I think that Ukrainians can't take that very seriously. Unfortunately, Xi, for all his apparent interest in being a kind of grand international mediator is not really much of a position. He's, while he's been cautious to some extent in dealing with Putin and has expressed support, but not unreserved support. It's got to be uncomfortable for him in many respects. But he's still, close enough to Putin to, I think, not be in a position to be a serious mediator. So I think on that score, the Ukrainians would say, well, this is not really a starter. The interesting, hard question is whether this meeting will be reflected in any significant increase in Chinese support for Russia. I would be skeptical. Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem to me it's in Xi's interest, but then we're all surprised from time to time, and apparently the Chinese are already supplying the Russians with drones, so they've gotten into militarily significant equipment. I would imagine that they won't get into significant arms transfers, but as I say, many things have been surprising about this war so far, and we could be surprised.
Yeah. And you mentioned the possible position of a future President Trump if he gets back into office. How surprised are you that the man who could block him, I'm not talking about Joe Biden, I'm talking about Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, has changed his position on Ukraine? He initially called it a territorial dispute, and now he says his remark has been mischaracterized. Obviously, Russia invaded, and that was wrong. And he called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. What do you make of this change of position?
Well, I think it's not so much a change. I think he probably, just misspoke the first time around. Probably didn't mean to say or said something that he thought was okay, but in context was obviously minimizing what the Russians have done. He's obviously walking this line, not wanting to offend Trump and Trump supporters very much, but wanting to cast himself as different, a sort of Trump with style, or Trump without the deformities of Mr. Trump. And that's a tough line to walk. And he's obviously it's a tightrope from which he occasionally falls, and then he has to scramble to get back on. So it's in some ways it wasn't much of a surprise, given that he is on this effort to not say too bad things about Trump and not say things that will offend Trump supporters. On the other hand, not say things that will offend those on the other side of the party who actually want the United States to be supportive of Ukraine and think it's important that we do so.
How worried do you think the Ukrainians should be by the potential for a change in the White House and what this would mean for American assistance, both through NATO and directly to the Ukrainians, given that a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill still support the effort for the Ukrainians?
I think they should be worried. We'll see. We'll have some test of this with the House of Representatives in Republican hands, and McCarthy sort of held hostage by the extreme right, by the MAGA right in the House. So it'd be interesting to see whether they make significant moves to try and reduce or at least cap the kind of assistance we're sending to Ukraine. But I think if I were Ukrainian, I would be worried about the 2024 outcome. If Trump got back in, heaven knows what might happen. And in any case, it wouldn't be the same as the current relative, I mean, it's all relative in U.S. politics these days, but, relative consensus, softening on the Republican side, but generally consensus that we ought to be as supportive of Ukraine as we can be, while being careful about not doing things that are visibly and recklessly escalatory.
Mm-hmm. Greg, thank you so much for joining us on Times Radio. Greg Tiverton, former chairman of the National Intelligence Council under President Obama. Thomas in Birmingham has sent in a text, not about this, but about my challenge to, I suppose, to position Harry Kane as the greatest ever England men's goal scorer. And Thomas says, Bonsu Zone. Hi, Henry. Jimmy Greaves would have to have one of the best goals per games ratios for England. 44 goals in just 57 games. I don't think he was a penalty taker for England either, unlike Harry. That's true. Because also I think Wayne Rooney scored a few penalties for England, isn't he? Because at one point I think he was the preferred penalty taker. Very interesting point, yes. And Jimmy Greaves did not have as extensive an England career as he could and should have. Thomas, very good point. Maybe Jimmy Greaves should really be considered as the greatest ever England goal scorer if you look at his ratio of goals per games. But, hey, you may want to throw one in for Harry Kane, because officially he scored 54 goals. Quite a few from the penalty spot. Your thoughts, please. And you can talk about anything else as well, including lockdown. Yeah. 3 years ago today, Boris Johnson stood at that podium in Downing Street and said, and he looked straight into the camera, no smile, he said, you must stay at home. And by and large, most of us obeyed. But 3 years on, so many people are trying to present themselves as lockdown skeptics. There are some who were like that from day one, like the polemicist Toby Young, and there are a number of writers for centre-right newspapers, including Alison Pearson. Yeah? She went over to Sweden and she spoke to Agnes Tegnell, the architect of their more easy come, easy go, trust the people strategy. We're talking about that in just a moment or two. Have a listen to it and then send in your thoughts in the usual way. Love to hear what you have to say. First, the news, though, at 11:31. Here's Tom Crosdale.